Bulking and cutting cycles are often recommended to maximize muscle growth and fat loss. However, this usually requires more tedious food tracking and potentially unwanted gains in body fat during bulking phases. So is it really necessary to go through intentional bulking and cutting phases for long-term changes to body composition? To answer this, we first need to explore the effects of energy balance on muscle growth. In other words, how does being in a calorie surplus, maintenance calories, and a deficit change our ability to build muscle? First, let's look at the effects of a calorie surplus on muscle growth. This study compared the effects of weight gain on body composition. 39 elite athletes from the Norwegian Olympic Sports Centre aimed to gain 0.7% of body weight per week for 8 to 12 weeks during their off-season. Half the subjects were assisted by a nutrition counsellor, while the others controlled nutrition by themselves. In addition to their regular sport practice, the athletes also performed resistance training 4 times per week during this time period. It was found that the nutrition counselling group gained more body weight than the self-monitored group. Both groups saw significant gains in lean mass, with the group gaining more weight seeing slightly superior growth. However, more weight gain also resulted in significantly more fat gain too. So a calorie surplus while resistance training seems to be effective at promoting muscle growth, but too much weight gain seems to result in disproportionately more fat gain. Next, let's look at the effects of maintenance calories on muscle growth. There are numerous studies which find muscle growth occurring in lifters without changing body weight. Although this study aimed to compare the effects of a surplus versus maintenance calories on body composition changes in a single study. 17 lifters with at least 1 year of resistance training experience and who could bench press at least 1 times or 0.75 times body weight for males and females respectively, and who could squat at least 1.5 times or 1.25 times body weight for men and women respectively, were included in the study. Subjects lifted 3 times per week for 8 weeks with a hypertrophy-focused training protocol training the full body. One group were assigned to maintain their body weight within a plus or minus 1% range. Another group were assigned to gain weight by around 0.5% body weight per week. And the third group were assigned to gain weight by around 1.5% body weight per week. And all participants were instructed to consume a protein intake of at least 1.8 grams per kilogram per day. After 8 weeks, the maintenance group successfully maintained body weight within the required range. However, both the small and larger surplus groups gained a similar amount of body weight, indicating that the small surplus group didn't quite adhere to their required calorie intake. In any case, there were no clear differences in muscle thickness changes between either of the groups. However, skin fold measurements were also taken at various different sites on the body, which is an indicator of body fat. The sum of skin folds decreased slightly in the maintenance group, but increased by more than 10% in both the surplus groups. And lastly, let's explore how a calorie deficit influences muscle growth. This was explored in this meta-analysis, which analysed the body of evidence on how a calorie deficit influences changes in muscle mass while performing resistance training. Overall, it was found that being in a deficit was less effective for building muscle mass compared with not being in a deficit, as we would probably expect. However, the magnitude of the deficit also seems to play an important role. A deficit of less than around 500 calories per day seems to permit further gains in lean mass, while a deficit of more than 500 calories per day seems to result in lean mass losses. So taking all this information, I think that the relationship between energy balance and changes in muscle mass and body fat may hypothetically look something like this. A large calorie deficit is probably going to result in some muscle loss. However, anything between a small deficit to a small surplus is probably going to be sufficient to build muscle mass. And a large surplus will probably result in greater muscle growth, but not much more, and will likely result in substantially more fat gain. Again, this is a hypothetical relationship, not something that is well established. Furthermore, the other important factor to consider when we discuss bulking and cutting is our current body fat. While I am unaware of any studies which directly compare how body fat influences muscle growth, Eric Trexler did an analysis of the effects of body fat percentage on muscle growth in this Stronger by Science article. An analysis of 7 studies which reported the body fat percentage of the participants in the studies were analysed. The amount of muscle mass they gained versus their baseline body fat percentage was plotted on a graph. It was found that there was a slight positive influence of body fat percentage on the amount of muscle that was gained. In other words, those who had a higher body fat gained a greater amount of muscle mass than the leaner individuals on average. So hypothetically, if we are leaner, a calorie surplus might be more advantageous to build muscle. Although if our body fat is higher, a calorie surplus probably isn't as important to build muscle. And the other important factor to consider is that the time spent in any given energy balance state requires a similar amount of time in the opposite state to be at the same net body weight. For example, if we were to bulk for 6 months and gain 5 kilograms or about 11 pounds, which would be a high anabolic state, then we would need to cut to be at the same body weight. We might spend another 6 months to cut back to our starting body weight, which is going to be less of an anabolic state. Or you might decide to spend 3 months cutting to get there at a faster rate so you can get back to bulking sooner. However, now that you are losing weight at a faster rate, you are in an even less anabolic state than if you were to lose weight at a slower rate for a longer duration. Alternatively, maybe you could just gain a little weight and then maintain body weight and just focus on providing a good training stimulus and eating enough protein. While we don't have good longitudinal research on this, in theory, we would probably end up at a similar place. Although, like we mentioned earlier, body fat plays a role here. This assumes that we are within a relatively healthy body fat range of around 10 to 20% for males or around 18 to 28% for females. If your body fat is above these levels, it might be a good idea to cut first to get yourself in a healthy range. And if your body fat is below these levels, it might be a good idea to bulk up to get yourself in a healthy range. Furthermore, the amount of muscle we build at any given energy balance state is also influenced by other variables. There are 2 primary variables which will influence muscle growth independent of energy balance. The first is another nutrition variable, and that is our protein intake. A high daily protein intake will increase the likelihood or magnitude of muscle growth we experience at any energy balance state. For example, this study explored the effects of a moderate versus high protein intake on body composition changes during a calorie deficit. 40 untrained men performed a 6-day exercise protocol including resistance training, various cycling sessions, and plyometrics. All subjects were provided with a diet consisting of 33 calories per kilogram of lean body mass, which equated to roughly a 40% calorie deficit for 4 weeks. Half the subjects were provided with a high protein diet of 2.4 grams per kilogram per day, while the other half were provided with a moderate protein diet of 1.2 grams per kilogram per day. At the end of the diet, both groups lost a similar amount of total body weight. However, the high protein group managed to gain a small amount of lean mass, while the moderate protein group only managed to maintain lean mass. And the other major factor at play here, independent of energy balance, is the training stimulus. And this is more important than any nutrition variable. Resistance training is the stimulus for muscle growth, whereas nutrition just supports it. And without any resistance training, you aren't going to build any muscle mass whether you are in a surplus, deficit, or at maintenance. Whereas someone who is training with all variables aimed at maximizing muscle growth has a higher likelihood of gaining muscle even without a surplus. As a brief overview, we would want to train in the following ways to maximize our chances of growth. Take each set fairly close to failure, at least around 3 reps in reserve. Train each muscle group with sufficient volume, usually at least around 10 sets per week. Lift anywhere in the approximate 5 to 20 rep range, and ensure fatigue of the target muscle is the limiter of each set. There are also some potential issues that people may face when going through dedicated bulking and cutting phases. Here are 2 of the most common issues. First is that bulking often causes an increase in body fat beyond what we are comfortable with. If getting leaner is one of your long-term goals, then gaining body fat is counter to this. And in many cases, people have enough trouble losing body fat as it is. So when they finally achieve a relatively lean physique, it might not be their intent to immediately transition to a bulk. And even if gaining muscle mass is one of your long-term goals, the additional anabolic effects of bulking might not be worth the gains in body fat. This is also more of a consideration if you have other goals too. If you want to be leaner for health or for performance of other sports, bulking might go against these goals until you cut again. So the bulking and cutting approach might require you to spend a good majority of your lifting career above a body fat percentage that you ideally want to be at. This might be worth it if you want to maximize muscle growth at all costs, but probably not if leanness is also a high priority for you. And the other potential issue is that bulking and cutting cycles usually require more rigid eating behaviors. They often require a specific rate of weight loss or weight gain, which might be inconvenient to integrate into your habitual lifestyle. Bulking might require you to eat more food than you were comfortable with at certain times, and cutting usually requires less food than what you would ideally like. While manipulating diet is just part of the process when it comes to body composition changes, we still want to implement nutrition practices that are more conducive with our lifestyle. For example, if you are currently cutting aiming for a specific rate of weight loss and you have a social event with family or friends involving food, you might feel restricted and overly focused on food at this event. There are certain strategies which you can implement to make the diet more compatible with such events, but specific diet phases usually make things more difficult to adhere to. So, bulking and cutting is probably not essential in all cases. However, there are a few individual circumstances which might lead someone to opt for the cyclical bulking and cutting option. The first is your training status. In other words, how long you have been lifting for and how close you are to your maximum muscular potential. We tend to build muscle at a faster rate initially, and then our rate of growth slows down as we become more advanced. So where we currently are in our lifting career might influence if bulking and cutting is more or less appropriate. As a beginner, a calorie surplus might be more beneficial since we have a greater potential to build muscle. So bulking would hypothetically result in a decent proportion of weight gain to be muscle mass as opposed to fat mass. And because of this, they also wouldn't need to cut as much weight to reach the same body fat level. Whereas an advanced lifter might only gain a small fraction of muscle mass during a bulk, with the majority of weight gain being fat. So as you get more advanced, you might want to opt for a slower and smaller bulk compared with a novice. And the other situation in which bulking and cutting is going to be more relevant is if you have a specific time that you want your physique to be at its peak. By this, we are referring to having the most amount of muscle mass and the lowest body fat at a specific point in time. For example, this would include someone competing in bodybuilding or another physique sport, or if you were trying to be in the best condition possible for a certain event. In these cases, you almost certainly need to cut to get to your leaner state, since such a body fat is usually not sustainable to maintain. And at a very low level of body fat, you are probably in a much less anabolic state, even if you are at maintenance calories. So to build any appreciable muscle mass at such a low body fat level, you would almost certainly need to bulk. This is to both provide a positive energy balance and to increase your body fat so that you are in a more anabolic state. So by default, bulking and cutting is almost always necessary if you aim to get to very low levels of body fat. So taking all this into consideration, let's establish some practical recommendations. Essentially, there is not a one-size-fits-all approach to bulking and cutting. For some people in certain circumstances, bulking and cutting makes sense. And in other situations, bulking and cutting isn't required to meet their goals. Here are some general guidelines of how to manipulate energy balance in different situations. Firstly, if you are above a relatively healthy body fat range, which would be around 20% for males or around 28% for females, you would usually want to eat in a calorie deficit unless there is a specific reason you want to be above this range. And if you are below a relatively healthy body fat range, which would be around 10% for males or around 18% for females, you would usually want to eat in a surplus, unless there is a specific reason you want to be this lean for. Within this healthy range, if you are eating a high protein intake and providing a good training stimulus, you are probably going to build a good amount of muscle long term, and the effects of bulking and cutting at different rates likely mostly equalize in the long term. For most people who are aiming to maximize muscle growth while staying relatively lean and healthy, it might be beneficial to stay at the higher end of this healthy range, around 15 to 20% body fat for males, or around 23 to 28% for females. You can then maintain this body fat for as long as you need to build muscle mass until you aim to get leaner. And at times when you want to be leaner, a small cut to the lower end of this range can be implemented, which would be around 10 to 15% for males or 18 to 23% for females. And even this lower level of body fat is usually perfectly healthy to maintain long term, but it comes with the trade-off that you might be building muscle mass at a slightly slower rate than if you were at a higher body fat. This general framework covers most situations for most people, although there are some unique situations that might benefit from more traditional bulking and cutting phases. Those aiming to diet below these healthy body fat ranges we mentioned need to do more of an intentional cutting phase to get there. And since this isn't really a sustainable body fat to maintain, they will usually need to bulk back up at some point by default. And those who are novices and starting out at a relatively low body fat might benefit more from a calorie surplus since their growth potential is greater, so they are likely to gain mostly muscle mass with less gains in body fat. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Check out flowhighperformance.com for online coaching, training templates, ebooks, and more.